All right, thanks everybody for joining in to our video presentation. Just to start off with a little bit of our background and what we do. So we are the Natural Resources interns for the Parks and Recreation Department. So we work mainly in Tandy Hills, Broadcast, and Stratford Natural Park areas. So we do a little bit of trail maintenance, making it more welcoming and safe space for visitors. We also map the trails systems, and we'll eventually be creating a official map. We also do vegetation surveys and stream surveys around the park areas, just trying to monitor any progress toward herbiciding or mulching. And we also do a bit of outreach, informing the visitors about how important and special Tandy Hills is, and letting them know a little bit about our rules and regulations. All right, let's get started. All right, so I'll be talking about some of the native grasses that are here in Tandy Hills. All right, so first let's talk about why native grasses are important and why we should care about them in the first place. So native grasses are important for erosion control. They're long root systems. As you can see here, they help to hold the soil together, and that helps with preventing erosion. So we see a lot of our parks that has streams or creeks in them. A lot of the times where there aren't native grasses such as these, there are a lot of erosion in the banks. So to kind of help prevent that, native grasses are a great way to prevent erosion, further erosion. And the root systems also help to recharge the groundwater. So when it does rain, it helps to infiltrate the soil much more deeply. And while it does that, both the root systems and the vegetation on top help to filter out any of the pollutants in the area that may have caught from runoff. And as far as runoff, it does help to slow down that water. And instead of the water rushing through small turf grass and going onto the roads, it will help to slow that down and again infiltrate it more deeply into the soil. So many of these root systems that you see here are very extensive compared to the turf grass on the far left corner of this image here. This is what is normally seen in parks and homes. This doesn't have the large extensive root systems that native grasses and plants have. And native grasses tend to make up about 50 to 90% of the total vegetation in prairies, which the other percentage is mainly consisting of forbs and small, minute, woody shrubs and trees. And unfortunately, prairies have been falling victim to agriculture and urban development, as they are easier to access than woody areas, and they are more fertile. And historically, they aren't seen as pleasant as wooded areas are. A lot of people think trees and forests are more, beautiful, but prairies are, more beautiful in its unique way as well. And because of that, only 1% of the historical prairies remain today. All right, so I wanted to go over a little bit about what we're working with in Tandy Hills. So as far as grass cover, in the vegetation surveys I have covered previously, we look at the mulch in the area, which is in the second picture here, the third picture here. So what happens is a lot of the areas in Tandy Hills have been covered with either invasive species or trees, which is not supposed to be there. So we go over with a mulcher, which essentially chops down all of the species in the area, the herbaceous, the woody species, and it turns into this land right here. And then leaf litter, next category, is essentially areas that are more woody, so it drops down the leaves from the trees and shrubs. So as far as the average grass cover here, we only have 24% out of the 6 vegetation surveys that we conducted throughout Tandy Hills. And that is very low considering that prairies are about 50 to 90% grass cover. So the goal with programs such as these is to get that number high and for Tandy Hills and other prairie areas to become prairies again. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and look at some of the grass species, but before we do that, I'm going to go over a little bit about the anatomy of a grass. So you can see here, this is the stem, and at the top, this is the flowering part or where the seed head lies. And each little individual part of the flower is called spikelets, and they have this pointing on structure here. This is something that can be used to identify certain species. And if we go further down the stem, where the leaf blade connects to the stem, there is different parts. So you can see here in this leftmost image, there is the sheath, which essentially wraps around the stem at the end of the leaf blade. And then we have the ligule, which is in between the sheath and leaf blade. And that's both of the ligule and sheath has, they may appear to be different shapes or colors depending on the specific species of grass. All right, so first we have big blue stem. As you may have seen, this one is a very popular grass for ornamental plantings. So this one is a warm season, and they have this upright, erect structure to them. So a lot of the grasses you may see they're kind of drooping to one side, but this one normally keeps their upright structure. And their leaves tend to be a little bit more blue, green, instead of just a bright green color. They do have a little bit of a blue tint to it. And the most identifying feature of big blue stem is we go all the way down to the base of the stem. It will have hairy parts to it. And the base may also be more of a reddish or purplish tint to it. And if you get to see them in bloom, you have the 3 parts flowering structure that looks like a turquoise. And this big blue stem is very good at providing food and shelter to many bird species, such as this western meadowlark here. And we got little blue stem. So as the name suggests, this is a smaller version of big blue stem. It also has that same upright structure to it, and as well as that blue-green tinted leaves in the summer. And they also have more of a red tint than big blue stem, because in the fall time they turn into this beautiful deep red burgundy color in the fall. And the way to identify this one is, of course, little blue stem doesn't have the hairy base that big blue stem has, and the flowering structure has a long branch of spikelets here along the stems. All right, so Cytosgrama, this one is a fun one. So instead of being up and erect, this one does tend to flop on either side. As far as the flowering structure goes, you can see this image right here. It does have these little oak-like seed heads. And when they are tilted to one side, they tend to all fall to one side. Hence, this is why it's called Cytosgrama. The leaves are also, has a little bit of a blue-green tint to it. And if you look along the leaf blades near the base, they have these uniformly spaced hairs. And these are also provide food and structure, food and habitat for the bobwhite. All right. Now we have winter grass. This one, instead of being a warm season grass, it's cool season. And their leaf blades are more of a darker green instead of that blue-green tinted leaves that we've seen previously. They have these almost spear-like seed heads. So this is one of their spikelets here. And this long part here is the awn that we saw previously. So it is bent at right there. So if you gather a bunch of these spikelets, you can even like throw it at each other. And this is why they're called more like a spear-like shape. You can have a closer look at this right here. This is where the stem meets, and this is where the flowering parts. And if you don't happen to see its flowering parts, you can take a look at its leaf blades, and they have little tiny hairs along its leaves. When you bring your fingers from the top to the bottom of these, they tend to feel like sandpaper. That's a great indicator that it is winter grass. And this one, because it is a cool season, they tend to be more, have more foliage still in the winter time. So it provides great food for many wildlife, such as the fire skipper, which happens to be the host plant for the fire skipper. And then silver blue stem is another great one. This one is an early succession grass. So when this one grows and dies back, and it leaves all its nutrients in the soil, leading way to more higher succession plants, such as big blue stem and little blue stem. So this one has a very fluffy cotton-like seed head. It's very hard to miss, and it's all over Tandy Hills. If you don't get to see their seed heads, you can just take a look at their leaf blade. They have a more prominent midrib, so it's that line going down the middle of the leaf blade, and they have white margins as well. Then we have seed muley. So this one took me a lot longer to recognize in the field because it didn't have these beautiful panel-like seed heads, as you can see here. They tend to be more, have pink seed heads. And if you're familiar with Gulf muley, it has a very similar look as Gulf muley. And the leaves are more thread-like and not as broad as other grasses we've seen. And a great indicator of seed muley is that their older leaves tend to curl up at the base and form this ball right here. And seed muley is also an indicator that a seep is nearby, which is water underneath the ground. Then we got Indian grass. This one's a fun one to identify for me personally. They, of course, have these beautiful orangey seed heads, and their leaves tend to be more of a pale green color instead of that blue-green color that we've seen. And the leaf blades are also more rough to the touch, and a great indicator that you're looking at Indian grass, if you follow the leaf blades down to where it meets the stem, you can see here is the sheath and the ligule. They tend to form two parts, and that can be seen more like a bunny ears or rifle side, whatever you want to imagine. But they all have this two parts, and it's a dead giveaway that it's Indian grass. Then we have tall dropseed. This one is also another one that's all over Tandy Hills. This one is not easy to. It's easy to be recognized because they have this wispy-like tail at the tip of its leaf blades. And if you take a look at their leaf nodes, which is where the leaf connects, they tend to have a hairy-like structure to them. And they also have a rough sheath, and we have rough leaves as well. And their flowering part tends to be really long and oftentimes reached all the way to the sheath. All right, and that's all I have for you. Thanks for listening.
All right.
Next, we will have.
Yeah, Jacob Estes. So thank you so much for that, Kimberly. I will be talking about kind of different than grasses, but also some issues that we've had here with Tandy Hills. Mentioned earlier, we have a lot of trees and shrubs that are kind of taking an invasive or rather aggressive growing standpoint. And so I wanted to talk about eastern red cedar encroachment, its effects on our prairies, um, wildlife, and public safety. So let's go ahead and get started. Interesting. Okay. If you can go back. It's weird.
Let's try here.
Hmm. Okay. Well, I guess
We'll do that.
yeah, we'll do this and then we can skip it on to the next one. So, what it comes down to essentially is habitat disturbance. That is what is occurring when these eastern red cedars are going unchecked and are starting to encroach on these endemic prairie systems, on these limestone beds, and the Grand Prairie, the Fort Worth Prairie. And so, I'm breaking that down into four different key points that eastern red cedar forests disturb natural water systems. Red cedar canopy provides space for invasive shrubs. The red cedar canopy also increases pest habitat, and it also increases fire hazards. So let's get into the first one, talking about natural water systems. I think now if we switch it to the presentation one, it
Okay.
should work perfect with water. So um, there are a couple of different ways that it affects water. And so the first one is that eastern red cedars are taking more water than your native herbaceous plants, your grasses, your forbs, even some of your natural shrubs. And so those plants, they're not only getting kind of the sunlight choked out from having these large canopies, but ending up what we're seeing is that with the little rainfall that these prairies are getting, the water is being caught in the canopies. It is sitting on the needles until they're evaporated by the sun, or it's trailing down the trunk and the limbs of the tree, directing it to the base of the tree, where it will then absorb the water. And so, not only that, but they're also taking more water from these soils and preventing these. These grasses and these forbs that Kimberly mentioned that have these large roots that pull water down and preventing that from occurring. And that moves into our next topic about water, is that the removal of these herbaceous plants is allowing for pollution and prevents water from reaching the water tables. So those very large fibrous root systems that these grasses have pull that water from into the on top of the ground and into the soil, that will deposit into our aquifers and our water tables, and just deeper down into the soil, that it can then be drawn on later as needed. But it's also allowing for pollution, in the aspect that these grasses, we often hear that trees are the lungs of the planet, which is true. But these native grasses, they become our livers and our kidneys, as they are taking pollutants out of the water and filtering them out as it runs past the root systems. In areas with healthy grass-based ecosystems, we see less nitrate, less phosphorus. And if you're unfamiliar with what nitrate does whenever you ingest it, is it starts to attack the iron in your body. It starts to attack the hemoglobin, which can lead to, of course, an increase in iron deficiency, or rather, it could lead to an increase need for extensive water treatment leading into the future. We can go ahead next. Perfect. So here, I went ahead and used some pictures for that. It's hard to tell a little bit, but so that is actually just a natural water runway, which naturally you will see more plants coming up in these areas, like not plants alone, but also trees. But what we're also seeing is all of this leaf litter is taking place. And we're not seeing any herbaceous plants here. We're not seeing a healthy balance between them. We're just seeing these invasive shrubs, which require less nutrients, and trees. So there's nothing there to kind of stabilize the soil and also pull any of that water as needed. So we can go ahead and next. So yeah, I mentioned invasive shrubs. That's a big one. So here in that picture, as pictured, I'm getting ready to grab a breast height diameter of an eastern red cedar, and all of that greenery around me is a Chinese privet. And so when you hear about shrubs, you often think, okay, like, bushes, hip, knee height plants. But that's not always the case. And in fact, in a lot of the areas in Tandy Hills, we're seeing this privet that's getting 6, 10, 15 feet tall. And it's starting to prevent and hinder the other plant life. And as these eastern red cedars and are starting to choke out these natural grasses, what's happening is this Chinese privet does not have the same requirements for growth. It feels more comfortable growing in the shade or the sun. It doesn't need as much moisture, and it doesn't, or it can still be drought resistant as well. And so what will happen is it'll start to grow up and sprout and grow aggressively in a manner that it'll continue to push out these native grasses and choke out any of the sunlight that they need, continue to draw water from the soil. And in some areas, we're even seeing that it has begun to overgrow and overtake even the eastern red cedars and other trees in the area, and has just created um, its own domain. And so not only does that become an ecological problem based off of plant and life biodiversity, but whenever we start to get into a situation where Chinese privet is an incredibly resilient plant and incredibly aggressive, but when we start to get into a situation where you see incredible drought, you see 106 degrees, above 100 degrees for um, 30, 40, 50 days, it starts to become a real fire hazard as these leaves begin to dry out. And if something were to come through, it would not be a small short brush fire. It could be more. So that would be a pretty big fuel load addition. So we can go ahead and move on to the next. So before I mentioned fuel load, I'll get to that in just a second, but I did want to talk about pests. So eastern red cedar forest, they increased, tick habitat, and also not just regular ticks, but ticks that will be carrying pathogens. And so an interesting study done by A&M Kingsville and Oklahoma State University, studying grasslands in eastern red cedar forests that were kind of starting to mesh and encroach on one another, very close to here in Fort Worth and very close to this similar ecosystem that we have going on here. Um, they found that across a 3-month study in a natural grassland, they only found 16 ticks, and none of which were carrying any pathogens. However, in a closed canopy eastern red cedar forest, they found 437 ticks, which a much, much higher number of ticks carrying pathogens such as Lyme disease. And that is just kind of one of those increased threats that we will begin to see should eastern red cedar continue to push forward and grow and expand on an area well unregulated. I can move on to the next. So back to fuel load and fire hazards, right? So there's a couple of different factors that will play into a fire hazard when you're talking about eastern red cedar and when you're talking about um, well, fire. So I broke that into forest density, volatile oils, and a shrub fuel load. So as we were doing our vegetation surveys throughout the plot, we found kind of some interesting statistics out about how many trees we would have per acre. So one of our plots, we found that we had 138 eastern red cedars in that plot alone, and so that adds out to about an eighth of an acre. And so, for reference, across the United States, what is considered a healthy forest density across many ecosystems is usually somewhere between 150 to 300 trees per full acre. Now, when we start to see the difference that is, when you start to actually compare and add up, some of the plots that we have can have up to 1,100 trees per acre, which should a fire come through and should a fire get onto these trees, it would begin to spread very rapidly, and it would have a lot to burn. It would not just be small grasses with a shorter fuel life. Trees burn for longer and trees burn hotter. That being said, with the volatile oils, that would cause them to burn faster. Eastern red cedars have a very flammable oil inside of them that to they typically use to push out pests. It's a defense mechanism. And however, if you start to see a fire come through and you have some of these trees that are leaking this oil, it could begin to spread very rapidly, like throwing water on a grease fire. And the last being shrub fuel load. In a lot of cases, these shrubs don't fully prevent or don't fully allow for fallen trees from being fully decomposed by grasses and native bugs and things like that. Or even sometimes they will just fall onto other shrubs and they can't even reach the ground. And now you've got all these shrubs growing through as pictured to these dead trees. And when you start to have a drought, you can see a large amount of shrub population that has begun to dry out and has climbed higher. Should a fire run across the forest or prairie floor, it could be like a floor to canopy ladder for that fire to easily climb and begin to spread. An interesting study done by the USDA found that although Chinese privet is a fire-resistant shrub and plant in a drought and in a high CO2 environment, similar to being right next to a highway, as Tandy Hills is, can very much increase the possibility and risk of fire and fire spreading in not only natural but residential areas. We can move on to the next. Cool. So, a prairie is a grass-based ecosystem, and during our times before mass human disturbance, there were two things that kept the prairie, and that were grazers in the traditional sense of the buffalo, and then even after our arrival and adjustment to the environment, we had cattle that were, driven up in fire, whether it be lightning striking or a drought causing thatch and other ground materials to heat up and ignite. Um, these two things kept the forest in check and kept um, kept the prairie, right? The fire would come through and burn these areas, and then the bison or the cattle would follow, and they would chew on these newly sprouting areas. They would pack seeds into the soil as they pressed over them, and so that is. These are the reasons that a prairie remained the prairie, and so this is what we're looking at. And when we think about we need to keep this area natural and revert it back. And however we do grazing and fire now, the idea is the same. And so I'll go ahead and talk about our substitution for grazers. So my suggestion would be introducing browsers, right? So as pictured, there are some goats, and so the reason why browsers is specifically with goats, they love these woody species, right? And it's a cleaner alternative to going over an area with a mulcher, and it's a cleaner alternative to spraying herbicides indiscriminately over these grasses and well, I mean, we're not targeting grasses, but there is runoff and there is the production of all of these different chemicals and all of these different fuels to run everything. And when you use a a goat or browsers, you don't have to have all of the extras, and you're working with the natural world to help the natural world, right? Um, and what we're seeing is we've seen in the Caddo and LBJ grasslands some success in this, where they have introduced browsers. And what their practice was a low frequency and high intensity. They would square off some goats in an area for 3 days, and they would find that the goats would end up picking this area clean and killing off some of these shrubs and allowing these grasses to come back. And so, should we have a prescribed burn and we start to have these shrubs come back, it would be very beneficial to have browsers come in, snack on our shrubs and invasives and newly sprouting trees, aggressive growers, and that could help keep our area that could help keep Tandy Hills beautiful and natural and as it should be. And the other one is fire. Go ahead and click that one. So when we talk about fire, what we're really talking about is controlling risk, right? Um, because as much as we try to manipulate and as much as we try to control nature, we can't, not entirely. And so it's not a matter of if a fire will happen, but rather a matter of when. We see it all over the country. There are wildfires that are even spreading and decimating areas that have a high amount of rainfall and moisture, such as Maui in Hawaii, and we see it all over the country. Um, and so, when we're talking about an area that historically used fire naturally, I mean, it's only one piece of glass reflecting the sunlight or one stray cigarette away. And so that's why recommending and getting a prescribed burn is much more responsible, right? Prescribed burns are planned and methodical processes. They assess the risk, they assess the plant life, they assess the area. They are there with preventative measures. They are there with an idea of exactly when this area should be burned, what kind of fuel should be used. They have trained professionals that have been studying this and are licensed to do so. And if that's not enough, prescribed burns are much, much cheaper than suppressing a wildfire. Prescribed burns can cost, I've talked with Jared, one of our associates, and also have done some checking in with resources from Texas Parks and Wildlife and the U.S. Forest Service. And before labor costs usually cost anywhere from $3 to $10 per acre, whereas suppressing a wildfire in 2021, unplanned, unwarned, uneducational to the public, costs $74,400. So when you use prescribed burns as a method to return your environment to its natural state and to control the risks that are posed to, in urban developments nearby. I mean, these are people's homes that you could be saving, ironically, with fire, the very thing that could be threatening them. So that's all I have. You can go ahead and skip on to the next one. I just wanted to say thanks so much for listening. And I guess we will be moving forward.
Hi. There goes Jacob, I guess.
Nope, sorry, grab my charger.
Okay. Let's get started on mine. I want to talk about, other than eastern red cedars, what the other issues plaguing the Tandy Hills natural areas. And these are all things we've observed over the summer. Well, unlike my associates, they chose things that interested them. I wanted to choose something that I felt kind of showed exactly what our experience over the summer was, and the issues we had to try and face and figure out solutions for. Let's move on to the next slide. Let's talk about the issues. Let's start with the man-made ones, although technically all of these are meant. Hello, Jacob.
Don't stop, you're good.
Okay. So technically all of these are man-made, but in terms of man-made, I'm talking about ones that actually include people in them. So let's move on to the first one, which would be the horseback riders. So one of the big issues with the horseback riders is just the trails they leave. They leave massive holes in the ground from where their horses' hooves have been. And when they keep going on them, especially in wet times, the holes get deep. They've gone very deep, so deep that there are spiders making webs in them. One of them, the one in the top, not the one close to the word horses, that one we actually took, and there were spider webs in every single one of them, and on every horse track we've ever come across. I have almost broken my ankle on them, unfortunately, but that is what we've had to deal with the horseback riders, as well as they leave manure everywhere. Not people don't want to encounter that on trails. It's gross, and not everyone knows what to do with it or how to deal with it, especially this close to a city. Now, one of the other things, and this goes with the next slide as well, because the horses are so large, if you come across them, you're gonna have to get off the trail, which leads to stepping on. It's okay, don't worry. It leads to you someone having to step off trail, and you just destroy the native grasses. Maybe you'll step on a scorpion, which is a danger to you. Either way, something gets hurt in the process of you or the horses having to move for one another. And that goes same for the next one, which would be ATVs. ATVs have a similar issue. If they're too big for the trail, someone's going to have to move, and either way, it's going to lead to a bit of destruction. Their wheels turn up the soil in an unhealthy manner, usually too early or at a bad time, so the nutrients in the soil just kind of ends up wasted. They crush prairie plants, they uproot the native grasses, and as I said, they leave no room for hikers on the trail. So, next one. The next issue are the photographers. They like to go out there without permits, which is something the city legally requires you to have if you are doing professional photography up at Tandy Hills or any other city park. Also, because they really want good shots, obviously that's what they're getting paid to do, they'll ask their subjects to leave the trail and go into the tall grass, which, as shown in those pictures, is something that happens. And when they do that, they end up crushing native grasses, native flowers, just all the good stuff. I remember something we encountered out there was, it was Jacob and Kimberly. I was sick that day, but they encountered a photographer who asked their subject to lay in a patch of blue stem. It has been 2 months and that blue stem has not recovered. It is still crushed and cannot become upright anymore because it's just that damaged. Another issue is they like to leave a lot of garbage. They leave props, fake flowers, fake petals, food, drink. We find all kinds of stuff out there left by photographers, and it's just a big issue. And trash is another issue with the next one, which would be the homeless situation. Now, as sad as the situation is, and I'd love to be empathetic, the homeless issue it can be a potential danger for hikers out there. Because we don't know why they're homeless. It very well could have been drugs. They could still have access to those drugs, and that's not something I'm willing to take. That's not a risk I'm willing to take when it comes to people on the trails. Also, because it's illegal to camp out there, they end up leaving a bunch of garbage and abandoning their camps, and it's just a whole mess all around. So we'll move on to the next issue, which would be, I believe it's the natural ones. It's the invasive species, which Jacob has briefly talked about, the one that's upcoming, which would be privet. Privet is the biggest issue at Tandy Hills, naturally occurring. I say naturally occurring even though it's invasive, but I'm sure you know what I mean. Chinese privet was introduced in 1852 as an ornamental plant. It was exotic, it was pretty, and it looked nice, according to them. But unfortunately, if people knew the ecological effects that it had on this area surrounding them, they didn't care. Because, yeah, privet is just a major issue. As Jacob said, it is severely aggressive and spreads incredibly easy. If you look at the pictures, you can see all of the fruits that they're bearing, and the birds like to eat those, so it just gets spread all around, and it is everywhere, and it can grow in any condition. It is just a big issue. It will outcompete all the native plants because it will grow anywhere, which is honestly the main reason all of these invasive plants are flourishing. And then if we move on to the next one, that would be Johnson grass, another invasive species that you have probably seen a lot. It is everywhere. Johnson grass is a huge problem. It was actually originally introduced to South Carolina from Turkey in the early 1800s. And as you can tell, It is now everywhere. It can grow up to 7 feet tall. It reduces grass cultures, which, as Kimberly said, not good. Grass cultures are incredibly important on a prairie, and if you lose the main grass species out there, you no longer have your original prairie. And also, if you look at that, bunch of seed heads, which means it spreads incredibly quickly, and they grow in very large patches that just continue to grow over time, which displaces the natural species. So we'll move on to the next one, which is sweet scabia, otherwise known as the pincushion, morning bride, sweet scabious. Either way, it's a problem. It's an annual forb that it will grow anywhere, but it especially likes growing near roads and paved areas. It is just especially good at growing there because it will just grow up from the cracks and it just thrives there. And I honestly do not understand how, but studies have shown it is currently thought to be one of the most dangerous exotics to roadside growers because it grows so easily there. I know on my commute to and from school, I will see it everywhere on the side of the road. And even up where we work at Broadcast Hill, one of the 3 other places we work, the 3 connecting parks are Tandy, Stratford, and Broadcast. Broadcast is the place we see sweet scabia the most. It is everywhere, and it will just grow amongst the fire wheels. And if you don't know it, you won't be able to tell the difference, but it's very dangerous because it displaces everything else. Now we'll move on to the next one, which is heavenly bamboo. It likes to grow near privet, and it has the same issue. Despite the fact it's not actually a fast grower like privet, it does grow very large. It grows up to 8 feet, was brought over as an ornamental plant in the 1800s. Again, it looks very beautiful, that I have to admit. But as per every other invasive species, it displaces the native plants. It outgrows it, outcompetes it. And fun fact, its berries are actually toxic to cats and livestock. So if it's poisonous to cats, I can't imagine how good it would be to the native wildlife like bobcats and coyotes, which, when times are tough and they can't find food, will eat berries if they have to. Let's move on. Now, who am I to just talk about the problems without making solutions? That would make me a complainer, and I don't want to be a complainer, so let's talk solutions. Solutions for the man-made, I would like to propose patrols up at those areas and other parks in the area, because people don't like being told what to do by a bunch of interns. So if we have patrols up there, people just won't stop until they're caught by an actual authority. Now, no one needs to get in big trouble, just a warning, maybe a small fine of like $20, $30. Even that I find is excessive, but they need to be told they can't do that. So I think patrols would be good, and it will keep illegal activity down. I also believe to help with the homeless situation, I believe signage at the front with the Hope Unit's number would be nice, because if people encounter it, they can just refer back to that sign and call the Hope number, and then they can get the homeless person to a safer place off the trail. I also believe trail cameras are also a big thing we should invest in, because they'd be able to show crimes that happen. If something occurs, you can see where it happened, what went down, and all that. And it can also show native species that come back into the area, because in Tandy Hills, not a lot of the old native species that were here 10, 20 years ago still remain. The coyotes and bobcats have been missing for a while, and all summer we have not seen many animals whatsoever, despite the fact this is over a 200-acre park. Now, another thing I think we should do, because everyone's excuse is they didn't know, if you put a big sign at the front quickly stating, no horses, no vehicles, you need a permit to do photography, no camping, boom, 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 just quick and easy at the front, so that people can no longer say they didn't know. If they just chose not to read the sign, that was them being lazy. And if they did read the sign and still did it, they did know, and they're falsely pleading innocence. So, next one. Solutions for the invasive species. As Jacob said, I believe burning would be an incredible thing. It helps so much. And I don't know if I'm pretty sure Jacob did not talk about this in his, but so one of the reasons burning was such a good thing back in the day was the ashes of the fallen plants, the burned plants, just reignited the soil and made it healthier and would allow for new growth just in a so much easier fashion. It's just the natural circle. Everything has to be burned down to come back stronger. Plants are essentially phoenixes, I would like to say. Another thing that I'm not so keen on, but might be necessary if we can't do anything. We've been doing pesticide all summer, and I'd love to come back and see just how well it worked, but our bosses have said it does work. I'm going to trust them on that one. But so I do believe pesticide is something necessary to help with the privet, the heavenly bamboo, and other invasive species. Now, something that kind of goes along with what Jacob said with bringing in goats, I would like to say I would love it if we brought back the native species like deer, because deer would love to browse on the privet and heavenly bamboo, if that doesn't poison them, that is. But they would love to browse on that stuff because that is something they like to eat. They like to eat woody species close to the ground if they're really feeling like it. And if we connect it under the highway to Gateway Park, which I believe is something I saw on the master plan for Tandy Hills, that is something that will allow deer to come and go safely from the parks. Because as much as I love Tandy Hills, it is not big enough to host an entire population of deer. That's not realistic. But if it connects to Gateway, that's something that could be possible. Now, again, something I'm not too keen on, but mulching is very effective. It does get rid of the species temporarily. It allows for regrowth in old areas that were previously woody, and it allows it to come back and become a prairie again. But you do need to go back and make sure everything is dead. You'll have to come back in a couple months, use pesticide on new resprouts, which is unfortunate, but it is a temporary solution. And I believe that is it. Thank you.
Can't hear you, Kimberly.
Sorry about that. All right, thank you everybody for listening in. I appreciate your time and hope you all have a great rest of your days.